Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into the week 2 edition of my top starts and sits heading in to this weekend's action. We got the Vikings and Eagles kicking off everything on Thursday night. So why don't I just go ahead, dive right into the video. As always, I'm going to be starting with the quarterback position, give you guys my top 2 starts and sits. So starting with the top start, yeah, it's going to be a name that you guys might be in question about, especially with how that Giants offense looked on Sunday night, but I think Daniel Jones is a good play this week. I totally expect that the Giants offense is going to bounce back. Keep in mind they are going against the Dallas Cowboys, who by the end of the season is going to be in consideration as one of the best defenses across the NFL. And then plus it was like the rain was coming down very hard. It's week 1 too. We've seen weird things happen in week 1 in years past, and teams bounce back and don't even look like they did in the previous, how they looked in the season opener. And with that being said, too, Sam Howell had some success against them last week. He had over 200 yards passing. He had a touchdown through the air, and then he only ran the ball twice for 11 yards, and he had a touchdown on the ground. So he had 2 total touchdowns. But that's why I was bringing this up, is because Daniel Jones is going to run the ball, right? A lot more than what Sam Howell did. So I expect that he's going to give you a very high floor entering this matchup. I think the Giants' offensive line is going to look much better against this Cardinals defensive line than what they did against the Cowboys. But even if they are kind of giving up some pressure, that's good for you as far as a fantasy quarterback, because Daniel Jones will be running the ball and, like I said, giving you that high floor. But I think he's going to have a lot more success through the air. I think their wide receivers should be able to get more separation against these group of cornerbacks. And more importantly, I think Darren Waller can potentially go off against the Cardinals. The Cardinals traditionally have been terrible against the tight end position in fantasy. They've always been in like the top 3 teams that give up the most points per game to tight ends in previous years. So that's why I think Daniel Jones, I wouldn't give up on him now. I would definitely have him in my lineup if he was my quarterback. My second start, this would be a streaming option for you. Maybe if you did lose Aaron Rodgers, or maybe if you have a quarterback in a tough matchup, or if you're putting together a daily fantasy football lineup, this could be a cheap option for you at the quarterback position. But I like Baker Mayfield against the Bears. I think he can build upon what he did and what was successful for him in that passing attack last week. They're going against the Bears, who gave up over 200 yards passing to Jordan Love. Jordan Love had 3 touchdowns through the air. And then you look at that Chicago Bears defense, which isn't great as of now, right? It's not a great defense. And then they just lost one of their better cornerbacks, Kyler Gordon. So that's going to set up success, especially for Chris Godwin, who will be working in the slot against a backup nickelback. So I would not be, like I said, I would not be surprised if Baker did what he did last week and even can build upon that and have a higher floor. Higher floor and a higher ceiling in this matchup. And one thing too, the Tampa running game did struggle last week. So if that Tampa Bay Buccaneers rushing attack cannot, step up their play, that's going to make the Bucs offense put the ball in the air more. So that's why I think Baker Mayfield's a sneaky play for week 2. My top sit of the week, I'm going to go with Matthew Stafford, the guy that just lit it up last week, surprised everybody. Nobody really, outside of probably the Rams fan base, nobody was giving them a shot to win that game against the Seattle Seahawks on the road. But this week, I would not bet on last week's success for Stafford, because traditionally he has struggled against the 49ers in his career. He has a 1-7 record against the 49ers. Since he's been with the Rams, he's 0-4 against the 49ers. He has 5 touchdowns and 5 interceptions in those games, and he only has 1 game that he has thrown over 250 yards. And I just think that the 49ers defense, they have a great defensive line that's going to go against this Rams offensive line. I think they're going to get after Stafford a lot, be able to get that pressure on him where he's not going to be able to find the success that he did last week. So I wouldn't be hedging on his week 1 performance to happen again against a 49ers defense in week 2. My other sit is a guy I think is still worthy of a bench stash ad if you're looking to bet on this guy's ceiling, when I think this Panthers offense will come together later in the season. But he's still a guy I would leave on your bench if you have him. But Bryce Young against the Saints. They do have one of the better defenses in the NFL. We did see what they did to the Titans offense last week. They forced Ryan Tannehill to throw those 3 interceptions, and they were getting his hands on him for multiple sacks. And then you got a struggling Panthers offensive line who just lost one of their starting guards. So it's already a bad unit who's going to have to play with a backup at guard. So If you're thinking about playing Bryce Young, I would avoid him at least for one more week. So yeah, those are my top starts and sits for the quarterback position. Moving into my top starts and sits at running back, I'm gonna go with my top starts. I would go with Ramondre Stevenson and Ezekiel Elliott. Obviously, Stevenson would be a really great RB2 play. Elliott you could consider as a flex play, or he can be a cheap option for you on those daily fantasy football lineups. They are going against a Miami Dolphins defense that got lit up by the Chargers offense. When you look at what Austin Eckler and Joshua Kelly did against that defense, they both combined for 255 total yards and 2 touchdowns. So while I expect Stevenson to dominate the most of the touches out of that backfield, I wouldn't be surprised if Elliott was to have a nice game where he gets like 60 to 75 rushing yards and gets maybe 1 to 2 touchdowns for you this week. My other top start, I am going to go with Jamal Williams against the Panthers. Mainly because Alvin Kamara is suspended for one. He's got that 3-game suspension or 3 or 4 game suspension, and so Jamal Williams' value is high as it can be at the moment. So you want to get the value out of him, and you want to look at this matchup. He's going against this Panthers defense, who last week gave up 177 total yards and 3 touchdowns to Brian Robinson and Algier. And the great thing about this is that this is Williams' backfield. So with that being said, he's going to dominate the touches. I could see this being one of those games where he pushes close to the 100 yards, and kind of like what he did last year with the Lions, get those goal line touchdowns for you and have a game where he's going to reach closer to his ceiling more than he probably will for the rest of the season. My top sits of the week, I am going to go with Cam Akers and Kyren Williams. I know Kyren Williams was my waiver ad of the week, but I did say last week, pick him up off the waivers, but don't play him. Going against that 49ers defense, I don't have to rehash everything I said about Matthew Stafford and how great the 49ers defensive front is. And you look at what they did against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. They held them to 41 rushing yards. Now, there should be some context to that. Obviously, the 49ers went up big pretty early, so the Steelers had to shift their game script and go to more of a pass-heavy offense, which took away the opportunity for them to run the ball. But still, they were going against a nice little backfield there, so I could see Akers and Williams not really getting much yardage and maybe getting a touchdown for you in this matchup. My other top sit, I'm just going to say any of these Ravens running backs against the Bengals. So obviously, the Ravens lost J.K. Dobbins this week, and it's either going to be probably Gus Edwards or Justice Hill who will end up dominating most of the touches at some point in the season. We get a clearer picture who's the Ravens running back to trust. But Melvin Gordon's going to work in that game. He was getting some work last week. They did sign him off the practice squad to the active roster. So my main reason for avoiding any of the Ravens running backs is mainly because we don't know how they're going to split the touches between them. I would like to at least get a 1-game sample out of that. And plus, you also got to keep in mind the Ravens starting left tackle Ronnie Stanley and their starting center Tyler Linderbaum are both considered week to week. So based on the comments that Harbaugh said to the media on Monday, it just doesn't sound that promising that they're going to have their starting center and left tackle in the lineup. So that's going to close those rushing lanes for any of these backs, even if you would want to bet on a Gus Edwards or Hill. So I would avoid them this week, and then look at that scenario and how to attack that backfield going forward every week. So yeah, those are my top starts and sits for running backs. So let's go ahead and move into my top starts and sits for the wide receiver position. Sticking actually in the game I just talked about. Obviously, you're going to play Jamar Chase. I'm not going to have to tell you to start him, but I'll tell you go ahead and start T. Higgins against the Ravens. You might be thinking like, the Bengals offense looked terrible last week. He got 0 yards, but keep in mind, he still had 8 targets in the game. So T. Higgins is going to get those targets that you're going to want to see. And just like I've talked about that Giants offense, the Bengals offense was in a rainy environment. It was Burrow had all that time off. They did the same thing last year where they were terrible in week 1. I don't think it really worked out for them in week 2 if my memory serves them right, but I totally expect this Bengals team to turn things around and get this offense back on track. And not only, I mentioned, like I said, he got the 8 targets last week. Him and Burrow just could not connect. But you got to look at this Ravens secondary. They just just lost their safety, Marcus Williams. Marlon Humphrey, Harbaugh said he has a shot to play, but he said it's early in the process. So to me, that quote told me that Humphrey's going to be out for at least one more week. So they already got a weak cornerback group. They just lost their one of their safeties. So that's going to give a lot of opportunity to a wide receiver group and a secondary that's probably going to be concentrated a lot more on Chase. With what they have back there. So that's going to leave a lot of one-on-one opportunities for T. Higgins, and I wouldn't be surprised if he has one of his ceiling performances in week 2. My other starts, I am going to go with Amari Cooper and Elijah Mitchell against the Steelers. Just because, I just look at what the 49ers did through the air, right? Brandon Ayuk last week had those 8 receptions for 129 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Deebo Samuel had those 5 receptions for 55 yards. Ayuk's a really good route runner. Amari Cooper is one of the best route runners in the NFL, so I could see him having matching that kind of success that Ayuk did. And while Samuel just had those 5 receptions for 55 yards, that's what I could see Elijah Mitchell getting 5 to 7 receptions. But I think he would be able to put up more yardage against this defense because he's gonna be able to. He's more of a field stretcher with the speed that he does have as a slot inside the slot and outside at the boundary. My top sit. Now, I upset some people with my last week's video when I said temper your expectations on the Davante Adams, which he didn't really have that great of a game. But with that being said, Garrett Wilson and Allen Lazard against the Cowboys. Now, Garrett Wilson, if you play him, I have some leagues where I have a better option to slide in. But there are leagues I don't have a better option, so I'm probably going to play Garrett Wilson in my seasonal leagues. But if you're putting together a daily lineup, I would look to avoid him. And Allen Lazard, I just want to play him at all in any seasonal leagues. And they're going against the Cowboys defense. There's a couple things, right? Obviously the elephant in the room, no Aaron Rodgers, right? We had Zach Wilson at quarterback. That's a situation we cannot trust at the moment until Zach Wilson proves otherwise. But then you look at the defense. The Cowboys defense, like I said earlier, they have one of the best defenses in the NFL, but they have Stephon Gilmore and they had Trevon Diggs at the cornerback position. I would not be surprised if Stephon Gilmore shadows Garrett Wilson in this matchup throughout the game and can potentially give him fits. So I see this as a very low floor entering this matchup for both of those Jets wide receivers. So I would look to avoid them if you can this week. The other one, I'm going with Drake London against the Packers. Now, I do expect there to be more balance, right? He only had that 1 target last week against the Panthers. I expect that will improve. I think it will balance out. But Arthur Smith literally spoke on the situation. He said he doesn't care about fantasy. They are all about winning games, right? So you got their head coach admitting that he's not going to game plan or for whatever reason. I don't know why you don't want to get the ball in your best skill position player's hands and make an effort to do so. So while Drake London maybe could get the squeaky wheel treatment this week and see a bunch of targets, I do also factor in that he could get shadow coverage from Jaire Alexander, the Packers cornerback. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Packers do go with that approach. So he could have one of the better cornerbacks shadowing him throughout this matchup. And then he's got his head coach saying, hey, we're not here about fantasy. We're here about winning games. So it's just a situation I don't know if I can trust with Drake London quite yet. So yeah, those are my top starts and sits for wide receiver. So I'm going to move into the final section of the video, the top starts and sits for the tight end position. Oh, the lovely tight end position that nobody can ever figure out, right? But my top start of the week, I am going to go with Sam Laporta against the Seahawks. I thought he showed some really good things against the Chiefs. Against the Chiefs, he did have the 5 receptions for 39 yards on 5 targets. Would like to see him get at least 2 more targets to have him as a trusty option week in and week out as a fantasy tight end. But I just go back to the Rams, right? They threw all over that Seattle Seahawks defense. I could see that happening for the Detroit Lions, and until they get Jameson Williams back, they really only got Ross St. Brown, and Laporte is starting to kind of emerge as the second trustworthy option for Jared Goff in that passing attack. And if that does happen, I wouldn't be surprised to see him maybe get a couple more catches, go to 50 to 60 yards in this matchup and get you that get him his first touchdown and you a touchdown as well. My other start, I'm sticking with these rookie tight ends this week. I think a guy you could roll the dice on is Luke Musgrave against the Falcons, the Packers tight end. This past week against the Bears, he had 3 receptions for 50 yards on 4 targets. Now, one thing I like about playing him this week is if Christian Watson does end up getting ruled out, that's going to be more beneficial for him. Watson's dealing with a hamstring injury. The last thing I looked up on that, he said his status is up in the air, but he hopes to play, but it's a hamstring injury. So that's something where if Watson gets ruled out, this kid could eventually start to carve himself out even a larger role within the offense, especially with how he did look in week 1. And then you look at the success that Hayden Hurst had last week, right? He had those 5 receptions for 41 yards and a touchdown against that Falcons defense. So I think Luke Musgrave is a sneaky play at tight end this week. And then speaking of a guy that just had that good week, right? Hayden Hurst. My top sit of the week is going to be Hayden Hurst against the Saints. Like I said, the Panthers just lost one of their guards. I think that offensive line is going to struggle to protect and give Bryce Young time to throw the ball. And then you look at Hayden Hurst. He's a streaky tight end, right? This is what he's been for fantasy throughout his career. He has his spike weeks like he did last week, and then he'll follow up the next week with like 1 or 2 catches for like 15 yards, right? So he's been shown that he can be a streaky tight end. And then like I said last week about Chigo, Okonkwo, who was my top sit of the week. Historically, the Saints have been one of the better defenses against tight ends in fantasy. They have always given up very minimal points to tight ends throughout the years. And then you look at what Chigo did. He had 0 receptions on 2 targets. So I wouldn't be chasing the points from Hurst from what he did last Sunday into this week. And my top other sit, I'm going to go with Cole Kmet against the Bucks. Mainly it's just because a couple reasons, right? So TJ Hawkinson last week, he had 8 receptions on 9 targets, but he only turned those 8 receptions into 35 yards. The Bucks did a really good job at keeping him and everything right in front of them and not allowing big chunk plays from the Vikings defense. Now, Kmet last week, he had 7 targets, right? Which is that ideal range that I searched for in tight ends. But the one thing I think I'm going to factor in on this is DJ Moore only had 2 targets against the Packers, and that's something that's been brought up to their head coach in the media. So I think DJ Moore is going to get that squeaky wheel treatment and is going to get force-fed a lot of targets that way, and that will just take the targets away from Kmet into DJ Moore's hands. So I would look to avoid Kmet this week in my lineup. So yeah, that is my top starts and sits for week 2 in the fantasy football season. If there's any players I did not talk about, as always, you can get in the comments or get into my DMs about any questions that you may have. As always, hit the like button, hit subscribe or follow depending on whatever social media platform you're following me on. Make sure you do follow me on all my platforms. With that being said, I'm gonna get out of here. I'm gonna wish you guys the best luck. If you guys got any questions, shoot at me, message and everything, and I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.